from colonies to states. Competition and wars among Spain, France, England, and the Netherlands in Europe often impacted their North American colonies. As Spanish and Dutch power decreased, conflicts between England and France and their colonies predominated. Throughout these conflicts, Native Americans became involved as well, whether through alliances with one of the European powers or their own logical or regional conflicts. At the end of this unit of study, the United States history student should be able to answer the following focus questions. 1. What were the similarities and differences in the way that the British and French empires administrated their colonies before 1763? 2. Analyze how the French and Indian War changed relations among the European powers in North America. 3. Describe how, after the French and Indian War, the British tightened their control over the colonies, and then summarize the colonial responses. And 4. What were the underlying factors in the events of the 1770s that led the colonies to declare their independence from Britain? Competing neighbors, New France. Samuel de Champlain founded Port Royal in Acadia in 1605, in Quebec in 1608, which is the first permanent settlement. French settlers in the New World had centered on present-day Canada instead of creating self-sustaining colonies. They created trading posts to foster relations with the Native Americans. Louis XIV made New France a royal colony in 1663. He and his minister, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, strengthened colonial administration, improving defenses, and promoting migration, but the requirement that settlers be Catholic, along with the requirement and the harsh climate, limited growth to about 15,000 in 1700. By 1750, New France had only 40,000 compared to 1.5 million British colonists, and large land grants were only rewarded to seigneurs and the poorest farmers renting land from them. A preponderance of males traveling to the colonies, but very few females. The Frenchmen, in their instances, integrated with the tribes of the Native Americans by trading with and by taking Indian bribes. The fur trade. Although the fur trade was the primary reason for maintaining the colonies in New France, especially in trapping the beaver, coureurs de bois, French for woodrunners, were the independent fur traders in New France. The Jesuits. Like the Spaniards, the French also sent Catholic missionaries to convert the natives. A group of Catholics that were devoted to the mission fields were the Jesuits. These black-robed men often lived with the Indians and tried to convert them, whereas the Spanish missionaries forced their converts to move to a mission. The French in North America. Thanks to French explorers such as Louis Joliet, Father Jacques Marquet, and René Wilbert Cavalier Sieur de La Salle, in the 17th century, France had laid claim to all the land west of the Mississippi River. La Salle named the region Louisiana after King Louis XIV. However, these claims were sometimes contested by the Spanish, and French traders and missionaries continued to explore and settle the Louisiana region, the Mississippi River Valley area, and in the 1600s, traveling south from Canada into the Illinois region. In 1718, Jean-Baptiste Le Moyne, Sieur de Berneville, and a group of settlers established the French colony of New Orleans at a vital point of the Mississippi River. The Spanish were concerned about the French encroachment, built a Catholic mission, later called the Alamo, in San Antonio, Texas, and then a presidio, a fort. The British colonial system. During the English Civil War, colonial administration fell by the wayside. In turn, the colonies experienced a period of semi-independent rule. As a member of the mercantile system of Great Britain, after the Restoration, the colonies were seen to be a way that Great Britain could increase its total wealth through its raw resources. The main aspect of mercantilism was the establishment of colonies to enrich the mother country. Government intervention was meant to increase the economic and political power of the mother country. This was done by 1. Providing silver and gold as well as crucial raw materials to the mother country. 2. Colonists were forced to buy goods created in the home country. 3. Colonies could become a haven for the poor, unemployed, and the prison. And finally, 4. They could not produce, that is, the colonies, to compete with the home country. The navigations were put in order and enacted for the global trade rivalries between the British and the Dutch. The laws were intended to ensure that Britain and its colonies benefited from the trade and to undercut competition with Dutch shippers. The first Navigation Acts of 1651 required all goods going to and from the colonies carried by English ships only. Smugglers in the colonies would use Dutch ships, which would charge a much lower rate to circumvent the Navigation Acts. There was also a series of Anglo-Dutch wars that would result in the Navigation Act of 1660, which required certain colonial products to be shipped only to England or other English colonies. And finally, the Navigation Act of 1663 required all shipment to first land in England in order to be taxed. The problem with the Navigation Acts is that the British wouldn't seriously enforce them, and especially after the conquering New Amsterdam in 1664. Colonial resentment. Colonial merchants disliked the Navigation Acts, but the government in England refused to lift the restrictions. This particularly hit New England very hard. In 1678, the legislature in Massachusetts declared that the Navigation Acts had no legal standing. King Charles II would revoke their charter. The creation of the Dominion of New England was an effort to provide direct authority over the area by the Crown under King James II. It was not well received and did not have time to take effect before the Glorious Revolution placed William and Mary on the throne. During the Glorious Revolution in America, with the new King and Queen of England, the Dominion was allowed to die, and the colonies declared that they had reverted to their previous governments. The restored colonial governments became official after they petitioned the monarchs for new charters. John Locke, an English philosopher, provided a compelling justification for the English's Glorious Revolution in 1690 with his 2 treatises on government. In time, many of the well-educated colonists who exerted the importance of colonial self-rule began to apply his arguments to their own efforts. Locke argued that people have a natural right, and these rights are life, liberty, and property. Sound kind of familiar? And that they have the right to rebel and overthrow their monarchs in extreme cases if they do not protect these rights. An emerging colonial system, the habit of self-government. The act to prevent fraud and abuses in 1696, in order to strengthen their control over the colonies, the British government provided for the use of writs of assistance, which were blanket search warrants to ensure that the colonies were abiding by the Navigation Acts. Efforts to reduce smuggling and reduce the Navigation Acts continued to cause tensions between the British government and its colonies. Prime Minister Robert Walpole. When Queen Anne died, the throne fell to the Hanoverians, which is in Germany, and King George became king. Being German and couldn't even speak English, George I did not have the understanding of British politics, so he would rely on the Lord of the Treasury, Robert Walpole, who would become the first prime minister in the history of Great Britain. Salutary neglect. Under Kings George I and George II, however, a period of salutary neglect began. That is, the government limited enforcement of the Navigation Acts in an effort to allow the colonies more control as they pursued their own economic interests. During this time, the colonies were virtually ignored and allowed to do as they chose. With time, the colonists became accustomed to this and resented later attempts by their monarchs or parliament to enforce legislation that had intervened in their economies. As we'll see, this time period played an integral part in the causes of the American Revolution. The powers of the royal governors. Each colony's governmental system evolved differently. as those with the royal charters and their governors, appointed by the crown, and those that grew from land given to proprietors and their governors selected by the colony's owners. Although the king no longer had the power to veto acts of parliament, the governors of royal colonies enjoyed this power, those wide ranging powers to appoint and remove officials and to grant pardons. The colonial assemblies, the lawmaking branch of the government, were elected by the popular vote of the citizens. They were in many instances modeled after Parliament and were charged with controlling their colony's budget as well as voting on taxes. By 1750, the colonies had become self governing. Warfare in the colonies. After the Restoration, both Charles II and James II pursued a policy of friendship with the French king Louis XIV. When William I and Mary became the joint monarchs of England, William brought with his coronation England's involvement in European wars. Over the next several decades, war erupted in Europe and in the New World on 4 separate occasions. 3 of these were but sideshows in America, with little involvement of the colonies. First, there was King William's War from 1689 to 1697, the first Anglo-French conflict in North America. The Americans faced the Europeans' war, which in Europe was called the League of Augsburg. This ended in a negotiated peace and reestablished a balance of power between England and France. Queen Anne's War. The American phase, 1702 to 1713, of Europe's War of Spanish Succession. At its conclusion, England would gain Nova Scotia from France. Following the conclusion of Queen Anne's War would begin the Golden Age of piracy, from about 1712 to almost 1725. During the War of Queen Anne, Great Britain had hired privateers and licensed armed vessels allowed to attack ships in which the nation was at war. When the war ended, you had almost 10,000 sailors now unemployed, and the only trade they knew was basically piracy. Well, the well-known pirates of this time would be Charles Vane, Blackbeard, Calico Jack Rackham, and Bartholomew Roberts. They would cause problems with all the maritime nations, including the British colonies, and by 1725 the age of piracy was over, when the maritime nations ganged up and put the pirates out of business. Then there was King George's War, 1739 to 1754, the Third Anglo-French War in North America. Part of the European conflict known as the War of Austrian Succession. New Englanders had captured the French fortress of Louisbourg, only to have it returned to France after the peace negotiations, which had a strong repercussions. The colonists were outraged that what they won had been given back to France. The English were equally outraged by New York's illegal trade with the French while the war was going on. The French had tried to halt colonial expansion of trade and their Indian allies by building a series of forts in the Ohio Valley. The French and Indian War. The Fourth Anglo-Franco War, the French and Indian War, as we shall see, was the exception to the rule. It began when the British colonists crossed into the Ohio River Valley, with both England and France had claimed. In response, the French erected forts in the western Pennsylvania to prevent further intrusion. George Washington, a member of Virginia's colonial militia, was sent with a small force to ask them to leave. When they refused, he was sent back with a larger force in 1754. When his militia unit killed 10 French soldiers outside the newly erected French Fort Duquesne, which is in modern-day Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Washington and his men then quickly built a small circular stockade they named Fort Necessity in preparation for a counterattack by the French. They surrendered after the defeat by the French on July 3rd and 4th, 1754, in the Battle of Great Meadows. This began as a war between England and France and their North American colonies and Native American allies. That's why it was called the French and Indian War, due to the Delaware and the Shawnees allying themselves with the French. Here we see a map of where the French and Indian War is going to take place and some of the things that we're really going to mostly focus on. We've already looked at, and as we shall see, Fort Necessity here. Later on, we're going to look at the Battle of the Wilderness with Braddock and Washington, 1754, and the final fight that is going to bring the defeat of the French is going to be here in Quebec. Once the British have taken Quebec, then this opens up the other areas of Montreal. The Albany Plan of Union. Benjamin Franklin's extortion to the colonies to unite against the French in 1754 would be popular again 20 years later when the colonies faced a different threat. The Albany Plan of Union called to discuss the mutual plans for defense. The Albany Congress accomplished nothing except the introduction of Franklin's Plan of Union. This plan called for the creation of a confederation of the colonies, which would be overseen by a chief executive appointed by the Crown and a legislative body chosen by colonial assemblies. The plan was rejected by the participants at the Albany Congress, but it was a forerunner of what would become the Articles of Confederation. In London, the government decided that there would be a showdown in America. The British Navy was dispatched to the French colony of Nova Scotia, where they overpowered the French forts protecting Acadia and then expelled 11,500 French Catholic residents, many who became known as Cajuns, when they moved to French Louisiana. Braddock's defeat. Major General Edward Braddock was sent to Virginia in July 1755 as Commander-in-Chief of British forces in America. He viewed the Native Americans with contempt. As head of 1,400 British regulars and 450 colonials under Lieutenant Colonel George Washington, he led an expedition against Fort Duquesne. The Battle of Monongahela. Near the fort, British forces were surrounded by 900 French and Indian forces, which defeated Braddock, who was mortally wounded. Washington had tried to warn Braddock that this is a different kind of warfare. You can't fight in columns and lines, so that the French and their Indian allies like to fight you behind rocks and trees. Of course, he dismissed the impotent colonial and wouldn't listen to him, and it caused him to get killed in the combat. Washington led the remnants of the English forces back to Fort Cumberland. Lord Loudon, the new commander, insisted on micromanaging every aspect of the war. He dictated the number of men and money each colony would provide. Colonial volunteers objected to serving under Loudon. British insisted on strict military discipline and fighting in columns, whereas the colonial militia preferred the guerrilla-style tactics that were being used by the French and their Indian allies. A world war. The 7 Years' War was the name for the war in Europe that corresponded with the French and Indian War. And the war in North America eventually spread to Europe, and that's how it was known as the 7 Years' War. Scholars consider it to be the first world war, as almost every European nation, along with their colonies around the world, participated. By the time the war ended, France, Austria, Russia, Saxony, Sweden, and Spain had fought against Britain, Prussia, and Hanover in some fashion. British Prime Minister William Pitt, known as the Conqueror, had treated the colonies as subjects and sources of funds to support the war. Pitt also recognized that treating the American colonists as allies would be more effective. This enabled the British to amass a force of 45,000 British regulars and American militiamen to overpower and capture the French forts at Ticonderoga, Crown Point, and Niagara by the August of 1759. The Battle of Quebec. The war reached its zenith at the Battle of Quebec, where French forces were able to capture the city and crush the French control of their colonies in the New World forevermore. The British, under General Wolfe, with 4,500 troops, landed with a successful assault above Quebec on the Plains of Abraham. They had actually taken longboats past the city, climbed up the cliff, and the French would find now they were blocked in front of the St. Lawrence River to their front and now the British to the rear. They engaged the French forces under Mattacombe of 3,000 troops and forced Quebec's surrender by September. Both military leaders, Wolfe and Mattacombe, were killed. The British forces were able to control other colonies in the New World forevermore. In the course of a war, a new king would emerge. The death of King George II on October 25, 1760, brought his grandson, painted here, King George III, to the throne at 22 years of age. Britain's military successes and George III's desire to seek peace resulted in the Treaty of Paris of 1763. So first we'll look at this map of North America in 1713. As we had seen, the British had gained 13 colonies, as well as taken Nova Scotia and won the previous Anglo-French wars. The Hudson Bay Company, which was a fur trading company, had claimed this region for Great Britain. So New France, of course, was north of it in Canada and also into Louisiana. The Spanish were split between Spanish Florida as well as the Southwest. In the Treaty of Paris, the victorious Britain took all of France's North American provinces from the Mississippi River to the east, except the little port of New Orleans, to the Appalachian Mountains, and all the Spanish Florida in exchange for Cuba, which Britain had captured during the war, as well as Canada. Great Britain now controlled all the landmass east of the Mississippi River. Britain was hoping to attain the Louisiana Territory as well, but through a secret treaty, France gave the land to Spain so it would not be taken to Britain. Also, the French felt pretty bad because they convinced the Spanish to join them, and the Spanish had lost Florida. Managing a new empire, following the end of the French and Indian War, Great Britain found itself having to manage double the amount of land it had originally had claimed, all the way to the Mississippi. The British also were displeased by the colonists' refusal to stop trading with the enemy while the Redcoats were fighting a war the colonists had started. In addition to all this, they faced a massive national debt that needed to be paid. At the end of the war brought some westward pressure. With the war over, American colonists viewed the newly acquired land as ripe for the taking. However, widespread Indian attacks erupted along the new frontier in the Ohio River Valley in the Illinois region in 1763. Under the leadership of charismatic Ottawa chieftain named Pontiac, they were angered that their land had been ceded to the British by the French without their approval. Of course, they weren't invited to signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1763. So they refused to recognize the British claims to the region, asserting the right to continue trading with French traders, and fought to regain the lands that they claimed as theirs. After a vicious fighting in the region by Native Americans and colonists, Pontiac's rebellion was finally suppressed. The Paxton Boys were Scotch-Irish frontiersmen from along the Susquehanna River in central Pennsylvania, who formed a vigilante group to retaliate against Costconga in the aftermath of the French and Indian Wars and Pontiac's rebellion. They were widely known for murdering 20 Susquehannocks in the events, collectively, and called for Contesco's massacre. The Paxton Boys marched toward Philadelphia in January of 1764 with about 250 men. Benjamin Franklin led a group of civic leaders to meet them in Germantown and hear their grievances. After leaders agreed to read their pamphlet of issues before the colonial legislature, the mob of men agreed to disperse. Afraid that more Indian attacks would end up happening, the Proclamation of 1763 would be the first act that would follow the French and Indian War. Great Britain wanted to keep the colonists out of the newly acquired lands to prevent another war from erupting and adding further to the burdensome debt. King George III passed the Proclamation of 1763, which forbid American colonial settlement in these lands. What that would mean is that they could not cross basically an imaginary line west of the Appalachian Mountains. Rising immigration in the period following in 1763 from Western Europe and had forced the arrival of enslaved Africans as well that were increased. Thus, the British North American colonial population was rapidly expanding. As immigration boomed in the established colonies, many colonists chose to move westward in search of opportunities, despite the proclamation of 1763. Regulating the colonies. George Grenville was charged with paying down the tremendous debt incurred in defending the colonies during the French and Indian War. Great Britain saw nothing wrong with requiring the American colonies to pay a small portion of the fees that they incurred for their defense. The Sugar Act was passed to help defray the cost of empire. Now, this was a indirect tax because it only affected a few people that were in the trade of dealing with sugar, while also taking aim at the smugglers. It lowered the duty from 6 pence to 3 pence per gallon on foreign molasses imported into the colonies. This molasses was used to distill rum in New England. It also increased the restriction on colonial commerce and put a higher import taxes on non-British textiles, coffee, and indigo, as well as Madeira Canary wines. It also banned the importation of foreign rum and French wines. So this directly affected the smugglers. They didn't like it because there's also going to be more enforcement to it. New Englanders, predominantly those colonists, actively opposed to the Sugar Act. They protested by boycotting British-made goods and also forming protests and attacking any kind of tax offices. The colonists believed that they were part of a special relationship with the king and that Parliament had no power over them. Parliament later would get rid of the Sugar Act. The Coercive Act of 1764. In the colonies, there was a shortage of hard money, which was gold and silver coins, called specie. To address the issue, the colonists had printed paper money, but could not be used in other colonies. Britain creditors were totally against this. The act prohibited the colonies from coining or printing money while requiring that all full payment be made in specie or a commodity like tobacco. The banning of paper money caused the value to plummet. In the background, you'll see the Spanish dollar, which was acceptable currency in the British Empire since it was made out of silver. In fact, it would still be a form of currency in the United States until 1850. That, of course, was the famous pieces of eight, pieces of eight. It was called that because the colonists would cut it up in eighths, and each eighth was called a bit, similar to the cheer. 2 bits, 4 bits, 6 bits, the next 2 bits, $1. The Stamp Act of 1765 was passed by Parliament to raise revenue in America by requiring tax stamp paper for legal documents, publications, and playing cards. Of course, basically almost anything that was made out of paper would have to be taxed. Newspapers, marriage certificates, and so on. This is a direct tax because it affects everybody. And Americans posed this as taxation without representation and prevented its enforcement. A writ of assistance was a general search warrant issued to custom officials in America. Basically, it is a blanket warrant. They could go in there and look for anything. It was never specific. James Otis Jr. of Boston called the writs of assistance instruments of slavery. Responses to regulation in the colonies. The Whig point of view. The colonists vigorously protested the new taxes in the assertion that Parliament had the authority to tax them. Using terms from the English Civil War, Americans who opposed British mercantilist and taxation policies began to call themselves Whigs and Patriots. They called those who supported the king and his policy Tories. Whigs felt that their rights were being violated in several ways. First, a professional army was still stationed in America. Second, British citizens had the right to be taxed only by their elected representatives in Parliament. There were no American representatives in Parliament, and British leaders countered that the colonists had virtual representation since Parliament represented the entire empire. Even William Pitt agreed with the colonial point of view. Protesters and secret groups who called themselves the Sons of Liberty, led by Samuel Adams, as you see pictured there from Boston, also emerged to defend what they considered the rights of the British subjects. They demanded that they would not allow taxes to be placed upon them without being represented in a political body that approved the laws. You have to understand, the only political body they saw was the Massachusetts Assembly. The non-importation movement. Many colonists refused to purchase the items that were taxed in lieu of their products, which were usually smuggled into the colonies. The non-importation movement was one of the first successful widespread uses of boycott recorded in history. The Daughters of Liberty were women who became involved, for example, when they refused to buy imported British goods, instead produced homespun material to use for their cloths. Colonial Reactions, the Stamp Act Congress. An October 1765 meeting of delegates sent by 9 colonies held in New York City, they adopted the Declaration of Rights and Grievances, asserting that the Stamp Act and other taxes imposed on the colonists without their consent given through their colonial legislatures were unconstitutional. No taxation without representation stated that the Parliament had no right to tax the colonies due to that there was no sitting members from the colonies in Parliament. They petitioned against the Stamp Act, repeal of the Stamp Act. Eventually, Parliament repealed the act while issuing the Declaratory Act, which affirmed their right to tax the colonies. After the fall of Grenville, the British Parliament and King formed a series of new governments, the latest during this time with William Pitt as Prime Minister. In his ministry, Charles Townshend became the Chancellor of the Exchequer, similar to our Secretary of the Treasury. Townshend also tried to repay the debt incurred in the 7 Years' War. The goal of the Townshend Duty Act was to pay the cost of the government by imposing new duties or external taxes in the colonies that Townshend believed the colonists would accept. New York Assembly in 1767, Parliament passed an act suspending the New York Assembly for failure to comply with the Quartering Act of 1765. New Yorkers saw this act as, once again, taxation without representation. Parliament saw a need to assert their power. New York gave in before the act was enacted, but the concern remained about imperial power. The duties were on a regular colonial import such as tea, paper, paint, lead, and glass. A new board of custom commissioners will be headquartered in Boston, home of many smugglers and the hotbed of protest, was to ensure collection of the duties. Colonists saw this as a threat, and they were concerned about corruption to pay governors and judges who would support Parliament. Colonists feared the Townshend Act was the first step towards greater British interference in colonial affairs. They formed boycotts of British goods, and British manufacturing was hurt because British exports were taxed. The colonial shipbuilding industry was not hurt, so it wasn't affected by the act. And the Townshend Acts would be repealed of all the taxes except the tax on tea. The crisis grows. Protests erupted in the colonies, many led by the irascible Samuel Adams. The publishing of James Otis' circular letter led to demand that it be revoked by the Massachusetts Assembly. When the Assembly did not so, the British government closed that body down. Divided loyalties. Loyalists, or American Tories, supported the British authority, whereas patriots, sometimes called Whigs, supported rebellion against British authority. The first bloodshed. The Battle of Golden Hill occurred in New York City, where Liberty Boys kept on directing Liberty poles. Later on, soldiers would come and knock them down. On January 18, 1770, a group of patriots caught 2 British soldiers. 20 British troops were sent to rescue their comrade at Golden Hill. As more troops arrived, they turned on the crowd and attacked. Both sides were seriously hurt. The Boston Massacre. After months of increasing friction between townspeople and the British troops stationed in the city, erupted on March 5, 1770, when rowdies outside the Boston Custom House began taunting a sentry. The sentry requested reinforcements. One thing led to another, and what the colonists were doing was throwing them not with nice snowballs, but snowballs that were hidden with broken glass, nails, and everything else. And then all of a sudden, fire came out. or a command thought to be fired, and the redcoats fired into the mob. 5 Bostonians were killed, including Attucks, a sailor of African American and Native American blood, and 8 were wounded. Paul Revere, the silversmith, would engrave what you saw right there in the slide of the Boston Massacre. Samuel Adams and other Sons of Liberty successfully spread propaganda that depicted the event as a massacre in Boston by bloodthirsty British regulars against innocent colonial civilians. John Adams would successfully defend the British soldiers and Captain John Carter of the massacre, leaving doubt whether Carter actually gave the command to fire. Following the massacre, Parliament repealed the Townshend Acts, all except the tax on tea, and after that there was peace for at least 2 years. The first bloodshed. The Battle of Golden Hill occurred in New York City, where Liberty Boys kept on directing Liberty poles. Later on, soldiers would come and knock them down. On January 18, 1770, a group of patriots caught 2 British soldiers. 20 British troops were sent to rescue their comrade at Golden Hill. As more troops arrived, they turned on the crowd and attacked. Both sides were seriously hurt. The Boston Massacre. After months of increasing friction between townspeople and the British troops stationed in the city, erupted on March 5, 1770, when rowdies outside the Boston Custom House began taunting a sentry. The sentry requested reinforcements. One thing led to another. And what the colonists were doing was throwing them not with nice snowballs, but snowballs that were hidden with broken glass, nails, and everything else. And then all of a sudden, fire came out, or a command thought to be fired, and the redcoats fired into the mob. 5 Bostonians were killed, including Attucks, a sailor of African American and Native American blood, and 8 were wounded. Paul Revere, the silversmith, would engrave what you saw right there in the slide of the Boston Massacre. Samuel Adams and other Sons of Liberty successfully spread propaganda that depicted the event as a massacre in Boston by bloodthirsty British regulars against innocent colonial civilians. John Adams would successfully defend the British soldiers and Captain John Carter of the massacre, leaving doubt whether Carter actually gave the command to fire. Following the massacre, Parliament repealed the Townshend Acts, all except the tax on tea, and after that there was peace for at least 2 years. The burning of the Gaspee. The Gaspee was a customs vessel that had become stuck on a sandbar while pursuing a supposed smuggler. Colonists rowed to the Gaspee and set her aflame. An investigation would be called off because of the lack of witnesses. Well, I didn't see anything. In response, the Committee of Correspondence was organized by Samuel Adams and others to improve communication between the Patriot colonists. The Boston Tea Party. Lord North attempted to lower the tax on tea while requiring that only British tea be purchased. In addition to the Tea Act of 1773, was supposed to bail out the struggling East India Company. Colonists feared that allowing one monopoly would pave way for even more. The Boston Tea Party resulted when Patriot colonists in Boston, Massachusetts, dressed as Indians, boarded 3 British ships and dumped the tea from 342 chests of the East India Company into Boston Harbor. Interesting to note that the first NFL football team in Boston was called the Boston Redskins, who would later move to Washington. The Coercive Acts. The British responded to the Boston Tea Party by passing the Coercive Acts, known as the Untitled Acts, by the colonies. The Coercive Act legislation passed by Parliament in 1774 was actually a series of acts, including the Boston Port Act. This closed the Port of Boston until the city paid for the dumped tea. The Administration of Justice Act offered lenient treatment to government officials who killed a colonist while performing their duties. Government officials would stand trial in Great Britain. This made colonists fear increased violence at the hands of British soldiers, also provided for the trial of civil cases without a jury, and of course made them angry because John Adams had proved that you could get a fair trial in Boston due to the Boston Massacre. The Boston, Massachusetts Government Act drastically changed the Massachusetts Colonial Charter. It allowed the Crown to appoint the sheriffs who named juries in Massachusetts. It effectively took away the right of colonists to elect their own legislatures. And the new Quartering Act allowed British troops to be lodged in any inhabited building or in citizens' homes if necessary. This was a direct violation in the British Bill of Rights of quartering troops in peacetime. The First Continental Congress. Meeting of 55 delegates in Philadelphia from most of the colonies, Georgia was absent, was held in 1774 in response to the Coercive Acts. The Congress endorsed the Suffolk Resolves. They turned the Coercive Acts unconstitutional, advised the people to arm, and called for economic sanctions against Britain, which declared the Coercive Acts null and void, were approved. They also adapted the Declaration of Rights and Grievances. Only a minority of delegates was willing to go to war with Britain at this time. They agreed to establish a Continental Association to put economic pressures on Britain to repeal its objectionable measures. The Congress also wrote addresses to the King, the people of Britain, and the American people. Patrick Henry of Virginia said, "I am not a Virginian, but an American," at the First Continental Congress. They decide that they will meet 1 year later to see if their demands had been met, or at least talked about. Last minute compromise. In early 1775, Parliament declared that the Massachusetts was in a state of rebellion and prohibited the New England colonies trading with any other nation except the British Empire. Edmund Burke, a member of Parliament from Ireland, claimed, "The fierce spirit of liberty is stronger than in the English colonies, probably than any other people on earth." Samuel Johnson wrote Taxation, No Tyranny in 1775, which he claims, "So the people left Britain where they had to vote, but little property, and now in colonial life they have no vote, but lots of property. And the Americans should obey the government actions, and if they wish to participate Parliament, they should move to England and buy another estate." The bold talk of war. Patrick Henry of Virginia, that you see in the painting before you, and the House of Burgesses, the oldest colonial assembly, stood up and said, "I do not know what course others will take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death." By mid 1775, King and Parliament had lost total control of the colonies. In Boston, General Gage warned that armed conflict would unleash the halls of civil war. Major John Pitcairn, under his command, an army officer, agreed along with Lord Sandwich, head of the British Navy, that the rebels were wrong and disciplined and cowardly, and by burning 2 or 3 of their towns, everything will be set right. The revolution begins. Lexington and Concord, April 19th, 1775. General Gage was under orders in the Secretary of State for the Colonies, Lord Dartmouth, to use force if necessary, to seize weapons at a supply depot in Concord before it could be used against them, and arrest Samuel Adams and John Hancock. When the Boston Committee of Public Safety got wind of this, they sent Paul Revere and William Dawes to alert the countryside that the Redcoats were coming. Thanks to the alert, the Redcoats were met in Lexington by colonial militiamen under the command of Captain John Parker. British Major Pitcairn ordered the militia to be surrounded and disarmed. He used a lot of foul language in ordering that order. The shot that heard around the world rang out. No one knows who fired the shot, but it ended up killing 8 of the militia, ending 10 more. The militia retreated, and the British then moved on to Concord. News of what happened at Lexington, militia and Minutemen from all the surrounding towns had marched towards Concord, and when the retreating column ran into the army, they were outflanked, outgunned, and scared. The Americans did not fight the British, but instead forming of an offensive line, the colonial militia used small squad company tactics to flank the British columns and inflict heavy damage, fighting behind trees and rocks. This style of flanking and shooting behind the trees, walls, etc., destroyed the British morale, and they broke ranks while retreating towards Lexington. The final battle casualties of Lexington and Concord, the first two battles of the American Revolution, resulted in a total of 273 British soldiers were dead, wounded, and missing, and nearly 100 American casualties of dead, wounded, and missing. The Second Continental Congress. An assemblage of delegates from all the colonies, this time including Georgia, convened in Independence Hall in Philadelphia in May of 1775, as they said they would do. After the outbreak of fighting in Massachusetts between the British and American forces, it became the national government until 1789, and in its early day, the Second Continental Congress did establish a post office system, establish currency, and on May 24th, John Hancock was elected president of the Congress. George Washington, one of the most momentous decisions was choosing George Washington to lead the Continental Army. John Adams of Massachusetts nominated Washington as commander-in-chief because Washington was from a southern colony. The Second Continental Congress wrote the Olive Branch Petition, written largely by John Dickinson and adopted on July 5, 1775, as a last effort of peace that avowed Americans' loyalty to King George III and requested that he protect it from further aggressions. Congress continued military preparations, however, and the king never responded to the petition. Historians believe he didn't even bother to read it. The Declaration of Causes and the necessity of taking up arms was also written mainly by John Dickinson of Pennsylvania and adopted the next day on July 6, 1775. It asserted that American patriots would die free men rather than live as slaves, by which the Second Continental Congress justified its armed resistance against British measures. Early battles of the Revolution. At the start of the Revolutionary War, Benedict Arnold commanded militia forces from Massachusetts. Fort Ticonderoga was located at the southern end of Lake Champlain in New York. In April, the Massachusetts Committee of Safety authorized Benedict Arnold with 400 men to attack a strategic post full of artillery and other military supplies that would be needed at Fort Ticonderoga. He clashed with Ethan Allen, who he met while heading towards Ticonderoga in his Green Mountain Boys. Arnold and Allen, with 83 men, would surprise the British garrison, who yielded Ticonderoga and later captured Crown Point. Both were forts the British had taken from the French in the French and Indian War. The Battle of Bunker Hill. In May, Britain sent 3 major generals to assist Gage in Boston: Sir William Howe, Sir Henry Clinton, and General John Burgoyne. Gage declared martial law on June 12th and offered a pardon to any American returning their allegiance to the crown, except John Hancock and Samuel Adams. Any American in arms, or anyone who aided, would be considered a rebel and a traitor, which means they would be hanged. Breed's Hill. The Committee of Safety made a counter move against Gage on June 15th, taking the high ground on Charlestown Peninsula overlooking Boston, moving to construct a redoubt on Breed's Hill. When the American position was discovered, the British immediately would fire from their ships in Boston Harbor, but Gage had to wait for favorable tides before landing. General Howe versus Colonel William Prescott. General Howe, with 2,400 British troops, engaged the 1,600 Americans under Colonel William Prescott. The British believed once they unfurl the flags and start marching up, it would scare the bejesus out of the colonists and they would retreat. Prescott gave the famous order, "Don't fire until you see the white of their eyes," and they were able twice to repel the British troops. Only when their supply of gunpowder gave out did the Americans retreat to Bunker Hill before being routed by the British, who decided not to proceed to Cambridge. Although technically a British victory, They suffered 1,054 casualties, including many officers, while the Americans suffered 100 dead, 267 wounded, and 30 were taken as prisoner. A British officer would remark, "With another such victory would have ruined us." Washington would reach Cambridge on July 3rd and formally took command of the army of 14,500. Also assisting him would be Benedict Arnold, bringing the cannons from Fort Ticonderoga. Independence. Thomas Paine's Common Sense. A 66-page pamphlet written by Thomas Paine argued that the fault of the American Revolution lay at the feet of King George III and his advisors, and that the colonies, he pointed out, of the absurdity of having a continent governed by an island. He attacked George III, the royal brute of England, for troublesome measures against the colonies, flayed the monarchical system of government, and demonstrated that a balanced government could be achieved without a king or a noble class, which America did not have of any. The colonies need to form their own nation and should consider independence. This popular pamphlet helped convince many patriots to move towards openly supporting independence, where before they were fighting as their rights as British citizens. With three months, 150,000 copies of Common Sense was circulating throughout the colonies and the world. The Battle of Moore Creek's Bridge. The Tory Council of War decided to attack at dawn on February 27, 1776. Lieutenant Colonel Donald McLeod took command. At 1 a.m. they set out. Although they numbered 1,600, they only had 500 firearms. When they reached the bridge, they found empty entrenchments, and the rebels had withdrawn to the other side of the bridge. An advance party found half the bridge planks had been removed and the two stringers had been greased, but Lieutenant Colonel McLeod would not be denied. An 80-man assault force armed with broadswords was assembled under the command of Captain John Campbell. The assault force followed McLeod down one stringer and Campbell down the other, to the beat of the drums and the Scottish war pipes. The rebels held their fire until Campbell and McLeod had crossed the creek, and then they let loose their two cannons and musket firing. No one was left standing on the bridge. Campbell and McLeod were killed immediately. Some Tories fell into the creek and drowned. Their companions, who had watched their quick defeat, immediately ran away. In the aftermath, 30 Tories would be counted dead, while the rebels only had 2 casualties. 850 Tories were captured, including Brigadier General MacDonald. This quick defeat ended organized Tory activity in the area for several years. Less than 2 months later, in April, North Carolina would become the first colony to vote for independence. Breaking the bonds of empire. The victory at Moore's Creek Bridge, along with Thomas Paine's Common Sense, would be crucial in moving towards declaring independence. Already, 90 local governments, towns, and colonial legislatures issued declarations of independence by the summer of 1776. Momentum began to build in the Continental Congress. John Dickinson of Pennsylvania was the only one really to voice caution and would refuse to vote for independence. On June 7th, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia moved that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. At first, 6 colonies were not ready to declare independence. A committee of 5 was formed to write the Declaration of Independence. The committee was comprised of Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, John Adams from Massachusetts, and Robert Livingston of New York. Adams convinced Jefferson that he should write the draft, that he was a better writer than he. Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Declaration had a list of charges against the actions of King George III that had led to the Revolution. In conclusion, it declared that the colonies were free and independent of British rule and were now a League of United States. It ended with, and for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. On July 2nd, 1776, to renounce the colony's allegiance to the British government, 12 voted for independence. New York abstained, claiming that they had not heard from their assembly. The next 2 days were used to debate the actual Declaration of Independence. On July 4th, 1776, after Congress finally debated the final form of the Declaration, making several changes before approving the final version without dissent, New York again abstained. Jefferson's eloquent and inspiring statements of the contract theory of government makes the document one of the world's great state papers. Jefferson took many of the ideas from George Mason and John Locke. You remember, Locke was the one that said life, liberty, and property. Jefferson changed property to pursuit of happiness. John Hancock, the president of the Continental Congress, would be the first to sign the document claiming the British ministry can read that name without spectacles. Let them double the reward, referring to the price on his head already. So this becomes the birthday of the United States of America, July 4th, 1776. As stated before, the Declaration of Independence ended with, and for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Unlike previous revolutions and those that would come after the American Revolution, the war for independence was started by the richest and most powerful men in the colonies. They had very much to lose. Each had more to lose from the revolution than they could possibly gain from it. Francis Lewis, a New York delegate, saw his home plundered and estates in what is now Harlem completely destroyed by British soldiers. Philip Livingston had his great holdings in New York confiscated and his family driven out of their home. Livingston died in 1778, still working in Congress for the cause. Lewis Morris, the fourth New York delegate, saw all his timber, crops, and livestock taken. For 7 years, he was barred from his home and family. Of the 56 who signed the Declaration of Independence, 9 died of wounds or hardships during the war. 5 were captured and imprisoned, in each case with brutal treatment. Several lost wives, sons, or entire families. 1 lost his 13 children. 2 wives were brutally treated. All were at one time or another the victims of manhunts and driven from their homes. 12 signers had their homes completely burned. 17 lost everything they owned, yet not one defected or went back on his pledged word. Their honor and their nation they sacrificed so much to create is still intact. Signer Abraham Clark gave 2 sons to the officer corps in the Revolutionary Army. They were captured and sent to the infamous British prison hulk afloat in New York Harbor known as the Hell Ship Jersey, where 11,000 American captives would end up dying. The younger Clarks were treated with special brutality because of their father. One was put in solitary and given no food, while with the end of the war in sight, no one could have blamed Abraham Clark for ascending to the British request when they offered him his sons' lives if he would only recant and come out for king and parliament. The utter despair in this man's heart, the anguish in his very soul must reach out to us from the 240 years with his answer. No. Both of his sons would end up dying because they and their father saw liberty and the fight for liberty to be more important than their lives and their fortunes. After all, they had pledged their sacred honor to the cause. The freedom declared in the Declaration of Independence did not apply to those in slavery. James Otis of Massachusetts had argued that blacks and women should be considered free as well. Slaves insisted on independence as they watched white colonists champ for independence from the British Empire before 1776. Even George Washington and Thomas Jefferson admitted to the hypocrisy but the majority of the founding fathers were against slavery, believed that first they had to become united to become independent before they could tackle the issues of slavery. Phyllis Wheatley, the first African American poet of renown in American history, demonstrated the problems of slave owners arguing for freedom. George Washington would personally keep a copy of her poetry with him on his campaigns throughout the war. We had always governed ourselves. And looking at the causes of the American Revolution, most Americans in 1775 through 1776 had a higher standard of living than their counterparts across the ocean. Their diet was better, their life span was longer, and there was more free property owners, but at the same time, the new taxes were higher in Britain than they were in America. Almost half were opposed to the rebellion. Think about it. Because of the cost of taxes only being raised to 3 cents in many ways, they wanted their independence. So why revolt? They were clumsy efforts on the British to try to tighten the regulation of colonial trade, almost similar to or as before, and they were very relaxed the lack of American representation in Parliament. The role of radicals such as Samuel Adams and Patrick Henry stirred up anti-British feelings. The most critical of the tighter British regulations were New Yorkers, New Englanders. Hancock was a smuggler. Paying more British taxes would have cost him his fortune. Southerners such as Virginia's Landing Carter would worry that the British might abolish slavery, taking away their livelihood. The revolution was mostly based on the constitutional principles of the consent of the government. This Republican idea was a crucial force to transforming a prolonged effort to preserve rights and liberties they were enjoying by British citizens. With the Declaration of Independence, the American people were now determined to develop their own society. But probably the most important reason for the revolution can be summed up by the revolutionary soldier of the time, Levi Preston, who said, "But even though he was not oppressed by the Stamp Act, or he never cared to drink tea, so he came up with a really simple reason for the revolution. We had always governed ourselves, and we always were meant to."